He hears footprints before he sees anything else. In 1979, the anthropologist Richard Borshay Lee knelt in Kalahari sand beside hoansi trackers. He watched them read a single print. From that print alone, they named the animal, guessed its size, and predicted which way it had gone. One footprint. A whole forecast. That patch of sand could decide who ate and who did not. Did the people who lived closest to the wild understand animal language better than you do? The honest answer is stranger than yes or no. Lee wrote his field notes as protocol, not magic. A footprint became a sentence about speed and intent, built from a lifetime of watching the same ground. Oxford ethnographers and independent naturalists recorded the same pattern far from the Kalahari. A shepherd in Anatolia listens to the tone of alarm calls moving through his flock. He reads the posture of the birds overhead and moves his animals before a storm arrives. He is checking a forecast, the way you might check one on your phone, though his never needs a screen. Trackers like these stack scents on top of scents. Scent on the wind, a feather's position, the exact way an animal had stood a moment before. None of it is supernatural. It is observation, compounded over a lifetime, the same way you would recognize a friend's footstep on the stairs without needing to see a face. None of this came from a hidden universal code buried somewhere in human memory. It came from apprenticeship, repeated for an entire lifetime, in one place with one set of animals. A single reading like that could move an entire camp by nightfall. Field notes like these can start to feel small next to what happened inside a laboratory. In the 1990s, the primatologist Sue Savage Rumbaugh ran an entirely different kind of test at the Great Ape Trust. A bonobo named Kanzi sat in one room. In a separate room, out of his sight, a researcher spoke one word into a microphone. Kanzi listened through headphones. Then he pointed to the matching symbol on the board. He got it right, again and again, under conditions built specifically to rule out any hidden cue from a trainer's face or hand. If you have ever doubted an animal's understanding, this is exactly the kind of test built to outlast your doubt. That result only matters because of what came before it. In the early 1970s, the Nim-Chimpsky project at Columbia University trained a chimpanzee to sign hundreds of words, and for a while, it looked like undeniable proof of language in another species. Then, the psychologist Herbert Terrace went back through the footage, frame by frame. He found that trainers were cueing Nim without realizing it, and that many of the apparent sentences were trained responses wearing the costume of conversation. Penny Patterson's gorilla, Coco, later learned roughly 1,000 signs. Alex, an African gray parrot, learned hundreds of spoken words. Both produced moments that looked unmistakably clever, the kind you would swear were almost deliberate, and neither one produced anything that independent linguists would call grammar. So go back to Kanzi, behind that closed door, choosing the right symbol every single time a stranger's voice said a word he never saw coming. What that proves is not that a bonobo speaks English. It proves that under enough patient human scaffolding, an animal's brain can learn to comprehend labels with real precision. Comprehension is not the same thing as grammar. If you have ever watched a dog tilt its head at a sentence it could never parse, you have already seen that exact gap. It lives in your own living room. Apes cannot cross that gap. The next question is when your own species first became capable of crossing it. In 2025, the linguist Shigeru Miyagawa and his colleagues published an answer in the journal Frontiers in Psychology. By tracing ancient splits between human populations through their genomes, they placed the biological capacity for language at roughly 135,000 years ago. That number is a floor, not a ceiling. It tells you when the hardware was ready, not when anyone first used it to gossip, or warn, or sing. Massachusetts Institute of Technology News covered that research. It set the finding beside something else entirely: beads and ochre, the oldest deliberately symbolic objects archaeologists can date with confidence, from around 100,000 years ago. Notice the gap. The genome was ready first. The culture caught up roughly 35,000 years later. A separate study in the journal Science Advances traced ancient regulatory elements, the genetic switches that shape how language circuitry develops inside a growing brain. The researchers found those switches spread far wider across early populations than anyone expected. Genetic readiness explains why your brain can listen this closely today. It does not explain what your ancestors understood the moment an owl called at dusk. That gap is the whole story so far. Now a machine is trying to finish the sentence your ancestors never finished. Groups like the Earth Species Project and the Cetacean Translation Initiative, sometimes called Project SETI, are feeding enormous amounts of animal sound into the same kind of model that powers modern translation software. The biologist Shane Gero and his collaborators fed years of recorded sperm whale codas into machine learning systems. The system found recurring combinations, patterns that look uncomfortably close to syntax. The Earth Species Project built its own audio model called Nature LM, trained on both human speech and ordinary environmental sound. It clusters whale and bird calls into types no human ear has ever cleanly separated. A machine can sort that for you, faster than any human ear could survive doing it across a lifetime. Here is where the excitement has to slow down. Researchers call this the cocktail party problem. A model can separate overlapping voices in a crowded room and label which voice said what. It still cannot step inside a sperm whale's own world and confirm what any of it means, the way you instinctively confirm meaning every time someone you trust raises an eyebrow. Pattern is not proof. So what is missing? In the lab, in the genome, and in the machine. A 2023 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences points at the answer. Human listeners do not crack a code the way a cipher gets broken. They use something researchers call ostension and pragmatic inference, reading a single cue and rebuilding intention from everything around it. Attention. Context. History. That is exactly what Richard Borshay Lee's trackers were doing with a single footprint. Brian Hare and his colleagues at Duke University showed how far a bridge like that can be built between two different species. Domesticated dogs follow a human-pointed finger or a human glance almost instantly. Wolves raised in identical conditions largely fail that same test. If you have ever owned a dog, you have felt that bridge being used on you. Every time it reads your stare before you say a word. Domestication did not hand dogs a universal translator. It built one narrow bridge instead, tuned specifically to humans, grown across thousands of years of living side by side. A 2019 theme issue from the Royal Society described how this kind of bridge works inside any skilled listener, human or animal. Sight, sound, scent, and motion, the same channels you rely on without noticing, all arrive in the brain at once. The brain stitches them into a single inference. No one channel ever carries the whole message alone. 2 field experiments make that stitching visible in the wild. In 2019, the biologist Toshitaka Suzuki ran playback experiments on Japanese tits. When he played their alarm calls in the correct order, the birds approached the speaker, alert and ready. When he reversed that exact same sequence, they ignored it completely. Order alone changed the meaning. The biologist Con Slobodchikoff spent decades doing something similar with prairie dogs and found a calling system that does more than signal danger. It encodes the size and shape of a predator, and in documented cases, even what a human happens to be wearing, distinctions you would never catch with your own ears. Put all of that next to each other now. A genome that was ready 135,000 years ago, beads buried tens of thousands of years later. A bonobo who can point to the right symbol behind a closed door but cannot build a sentence of his own. A machine that can hear shape inside a whale's call but cannot tell you what the whale meant by it. Birds and prairie dogs pack real structure into a handful of notes. Structure a trained human ear can finally measure after decades of trying. None of it adds up to a lost universal language, once shared between humans and animals and somehow forgotten along the way. It adds up to something humbler, and in its own way, more impressive. Your ancestors were not telepaths. They were apprentices, spending entire lifetimes inside one ecosystem, until a single footprint, or a single alarm call, or a single shift in a flock's posture carried as much information to them as a full sentence carries to you. They listened better than almost anyone alive today. They never spoke whale.